waiting further. First of all, I would like to thank you for having accepted our invite at such a short notice. And we are also happy to know that the issue on Iran has come out very well, and some very useful contributions from the uh, diplomats, from academics, from media persons. They have been there, and that's why we thought that you should explain things about your book. I think you are the most competent person to do it, and we will like to hear you more on the subject. That's why we thought of inviting you. So thank you very much, and you can go ahead with your presentation, please.
Well, I want to start by apologizing to everyone for my delay, and I hope I'll be able to make it up. I also want to thank Professor Gore for reaching out to me after I sent the information about my book to him, and so kindly inviting me to be with you this morning, this afternoon, evening, on many of your times. I also want to express my gratitude to the Foreign Policy Research Center, of course. So it's an honor, it's a pleasure. And without further ado, I'll start by explaining the book that I have just published, which is The World Powers in Iran Before, During, and After the Nuclear Deal. By the way, I hope you can hear me well enough. So it's always daunting for me to present a book because as many of you are authors, you would know when you write a big project, it becomes harder to speak about it and even harder to summarize it. But I'm very excited to be able to do this with an audience from India as well, because when I decided to write this book, I decided immediately that I must have a chapter on India and on India's ties with Iran. And the reason that I decided on that was that I actually lived in Iran after the revolution and during the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, and in the 1990s as well. And I remember growing up as a child back then, how much attention Iran paid to India's nuclear program. And I grew up based on my limited understanding of the debates that were happening inside Iran at the time, reaching a conviction that Iran perhaps embarked on its nuclear program first and foremost because India and Pakistan had developed a nuclear program, a strong nuclear program. I think that was the main trigger of Iran's decision partly to embark on an advanced nuclear program. But of course, there are many other triggers for this program. And so the book is divided into several chapters, including as well Iran's relations with China, Iran's relations with Russia, Iran's relations with the EU3, i.e. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as to an extent the European Union as a collective body, and Iran and the United States, of course. So if you allow me, I'll start with the introduction on the book. And the book really is an academic publishing. And so there's a theoretical framework to the arguments that are presented in it. And primarily, it examines how Iran, as a middle power, was able to change world power calculations in advancing a strong nuclear program. The book also theoretically tries to show how the dynamics of the world power interactions were towards Iran in the period before, during, and after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which, as you know, was concluded in 2015, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, and how the internal dynamics of world power relations among themselves actually led to the weakening of the proliferation regime with respect to Iran's nuclear program. So what I do in the book is apply theories of realism mainly, and neorealism to examining Iran's relations with the world powers and with India, and to Iran's application of ideational and material power to building up its nuclear program. And by ideational power, of course, I mean the use of ideology and ideological narratives to build elite consensus inside Iran and to an extent outside Iran among people and groups that somehow subscribe to or analyze Iran's ideological points of views. And by material power, I mean material capabilities required to build an advanced nuclear program. So with that introduction, the book then proceeds first and foremost to examine US-Iran relations. And I explain in this specific chapter how the relationship defies explanations and how theory is unable to explain the constant hostility in US-Iran relations, as we know, especially since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And then I explain how realism and neorealism are limited in explaining the reason behind this constant hostility. And then I explain the ideational aspects of Iran's ties to the United States and how Iran went about explaining its ideology in order to build a narrative, an elite narrative that advanced the nuclear program, irrespective of the fact that in the United States, they were hedging on the idea that a change of leadership in Iran among its presidents, etc., might bring about a course in its nuclear program. And so I explain why that assumption was a false assumption in the United States from an ideational point of view. And as I tie the US-Iran chapter to the book, I think I skipped a portion of my introduction to the book that is important. When I explained in the beginning of my conversation that Iran theoretically tried to challenge, how Iran theoretically tried to challenge in the world powers, I forgot to mention a few, let's say, tactics that Iran employed in this process. And they were primarily three tactics. First and foremost, Iran used narratives against prevailing world power interpretations of nuclear power. In other words, who's to say that because you are a Western power or because you are Russia or China or even India, that you can dictate the outcome of the proliferation regime? And it went about producing narratives on a mass scale to advance this argument. In addition, Iran built leverage, built power through association with Asian powers. And that's where India fits in very neatly in Iran's calculations of advancing its nuclear program through an association with India, through a relation, through maintaining a diplomatic and other forms of relations with India, which I will discuss later on. And finally, Iran employed shame tactics in challenging the extreme authority of the major powers in holding on to what a nuclear power and a nuclear power state in the global south should look like, the idea of it. But more importantly, while using these narratives, Iran advanced, actually advanced, in my opinion, advertently, modes of engagements with the world powers as well as with India that led to kind of a Hobbesian space, a bit Hobbesian space, in that it created a mixture of combinations and options for the world powers in India to engage with it. Meanwhile, through that engagement, advancing its nuclear program. So engagement in and by itself became a tool for Iran's ability to reach a very advanced stage of its nuclear program. The second chapter of the book looks at EU-Iran relations. And in each chapter, I actually also start by examining the history of the relations. So for those of you who might have a chance to look at the book, the history itself is also very telling in why Iran treats the Europeans or the United States in a certain way in advancing its nuclear program. But if you allow me, because I think much of our conversation would evolve based on the Q&A, I'll skip the history unless you're interested in hearing about it later on, and I'll be happy to talk about it more. But with the EU and Iran, basically, I look at how this relationship negatively impacted the Western desire to halt Iran's advancement of its nuclear program. In other words, the European Union, and especially Germany, UK, and France, while trying to hinder the nuclear program, actually employed policies that enabled Iran to advance its nuclear program. And so the book looks at this, and also at how Iran was able to use the weakness of the diplomacy in Europe to also weaken the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States of America over the course of the Iran nuclear program. And so by weakening that bond, Iran was also able to advance its nuclear program. And I can get into details later on if you might have any questions. The next chapter of the book moves to the important relationship between Russia and Iran. And it discusses the relationship based on basic realism theory. And especially in Russian calculations of handling Iran's challenge, because obviously, as a neighbor, Russia does not like to see a nuclear Iran, but in building a dialogue with Iran over its nuclear program, unlike the West, it has mattered far less to Russia what regime or what government or what system of governance prevails in Iran. It's far more important for Russia to be able to retain a very historic and deep influence over Iran, not just politically, but also over Iran's. Russia has a certain influence inside Iran in that it is able to also navigate the Iranian sentiments, the sentiments of its elite. It has a lot of sources of information in understanding the people of Iran, the elite of Iran, more than any other world power examined in this book. And that gives Russia a certain kind of perspective about how to manage the challenge of Iran's nuclear program. Generally, Russia has avoided crafting big policies toward Iran. And when it has seemingly embraced a relationship with Iran to this day, it must have always favored Russian interests primarily, because let's not forget that Russia is the major power in this relationship. And this is by no means a strategic relationship in the sense that Russia must always exercise an upper hand, whether it be regarding its bilateral relations with Iran or in managing the Iranian nuclear program, or in being a partner in the JCPOA. The chapter after Russia examines the China-Iran relationship, and I argue that the partnership is an auxiliary partnership in fact, that China and Iran are united in containing pressures from the West primarily. Ideationally, the two countries will never see eye to eye, because we are speaking of a communist a communist China and an Islamic Iran. However, as Asian powers, they have had sensibilities that lead to an understanding about not making the ideational aspects of their differences a sore point of their relations. But But as a result of, partly as a result of these dynamics, the relationship is not as strategic as one imagines, except in recent history where they have embarked on a strategic partnership of a long-term nature. But I'll say a few words about that. It is an auxiliary partnership in that they need each other and they use each other based on that need basis. And if you look at the evolution of China-Iran relations, and I linger on this a little more because I know that India-China relations also matter a lot to New Delhi, is because when I studied the China-Iran relationship and its evolution before, during, and after the JCPOA, using a lot of research, doing a lot of research on elite narratives that emerged inside Iran about this relationship, I understood very clearly that Iran had to an extent not taken China very seriously at all times. And till the very last second, even under the presidency of Hassan Rouhani, Iran was hoping to sign on to a real partnership deal with the West, both diplomatically and economically, to kind of be able to ignore to an extent its relationship with China. And in the history section of this chapter, I explain in detail why the feelings and sentiments of Iranians in general toward Russia, in that they have viewed it as a necessary world power. They have thought there would be benefits perhaps accruing from its partnership with China, even more than its partnership with the United States, but that for reasons that I explain in this chapter, Iran has not ever been able to favor China over the West. But obviously the strategic partnership changes that dynamic to an extent, but we must remember that this new strategic agreement is an extension of an old prior strategic agreement that China and Iran had that was for 20 years and is ongoing but about to expire. So while it is new, there's also not much new about it. But what is newer about it is the fact that Chinese investments will be more forthcoming, given that the JCPOA's outcome is uncertain. The final chapter of the book examines India and Iran. And I start with a story of how President Rouhani landed in 2018 after, a first visit, after a long time to India, and made a point of landing in Hyderabad while Prime Minister Modi was awaiting his arrival in New Delhi. And in Hyderabad, President Rouhani made a point, as you know better than I do, of meeting with the Parsi community, with people in the area that are of Iranian origin, with business community, with very broad, and really not only just inviting the Indian business community to invest in Iran, but sending a signal to New Delhi that Iran wanted it to reinvest, to deliver on the previous promises that it had made to Iran to invest, but had withdrawn because of the dynamics of US-India relations, a subject that I know that FBRC has delved into in its recent journal, because Professor Gore kindly shared that journal content with me, and I was actually reading it last night. So I look at how the dynamics of the US-India partnerships, including on the nuclear front, have affected Iran, and how India's ability to test the nuclear, basically its nuclear capabilities, triggered the idea in Iran that if India could somehow do it under US watch, then it's possible that other countries could do it as well. And so I explain how that thinking evolved inside Iran. But I also talk about India-Iran economic relations and political relations. But more specifically back to the topic of the nuclear issue, which is the primal focus point of this book. The chapter looks at how India's non-commitment to the NPT helped shape some of Iran's narratives about advancing its nuclear program while engaging in negotiations with the world powers, and how India becoming a nuclear state was almost too much for Iran to bear, considering that China and Russia were also nuclear states, not to mention Pakistan. But then I look at how India has viewed this issue regarding Iran, and understandably so, feeling that Iran's potential nuclearization could jeopardize a 1987 missile technology control regime of which India was a member, as well as a 1974 nuclear supplier group of which neither Iran nor India were part of, but then thereby making Iran's potential nuclearization a threat to India's interests, more specifically in the Gulf region, in the Persian Gulf region, where, as we know, India has very important economic ties. So as a result of these dynamics, when the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan, India and Iran, while engaging, at least from Iran's point of view, while that engagement was necessary, Iran came into this dynamic with India over Afghanistan with a little bit of history about its dynamics over the evolution of its nuclear program and where India stood on it, kind of half-hearted in engaging with India, always kind of hoping that India would have a marginal role and Iran a more central role, because it felt that there was a non-delivery aspect to the India-Iran promises and relations. And while some of that non-delivery was the product of times and sanctions, Western sanctions specifically on Iran, part of it was because perhaps in my view, India could afford to ignore Iran when it needed to. And that didn't quite register very easily with Iran, because Iran had emotionally lost a lot of its bond with India after the partition of India, as we know, when the geographic distance between them emerged, a sort of an emotional distance also emerged that in essence led to an aloofness in the relationship, and perhaps more so on Iran's side, but I would be very keen to understand if India has also felt that aloofness toward Iran, and that has marked the relationship. But what that means essentially about the current state of the relations is that there are too many Indian stipulations to having its ties with Iran, and Iran now opening up to China. There are debates that as unreliable as Chinese investments were for a period of time, that Indian promises of investments are less reliable and not a source of comfort for Iran, given the history of non-delivery on promises. And the fluctuating trade that in my chapter, there's a clear connection between India's relations with Washington and this fluctuating trade pattern. And it hasn't always been bad. Actually, even under Trump, the Trump administration, there were times where the trade between India and Iran picked up. And that went to say, which is the point I make in the conclusion of this chapter, that India does enjoy, as you say, a strategic autonomy in making its decisions with Iran, but a level of it, but the full potential of that strategic autonomy has not emerged. More importantly, although Iran would like to see India be the marginal Asian power in this dynamic, the fact of the matter is that India has the upper hand in this dynamic, both as a nuclear state, as a powerful state. India is a far more powerful state than Iran is as an Asian country. And so the prospects of the India-Iran relationships show an interesting pattern. While there are overlapping interests and economic interests can override other strategic and diverging interests, as well as some security concerns, they have, of course, led to a non-confrontational relationship with Iran. But when Iran is increasingly isolated, it views these economic and security concerns that it has with India as a reason to hope that India will remain the marginal power in this relationship. But to the extent, to the extent that the India-Iran relationship is independent of external foreign pressures, it has helped stabilize essentially the Indian Ocean as well as the Persian Gulf. And it has inadvertently even advanced Washington's balancing goals on the security front in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere, including in Afghanistan to an extent. And it has also advanced India's and Iran's mutual desire to rise as regional powers, which Iran has depended on as an Asian power to advance its nuclear program. But Iran's inability to overcome US tensions and build its ties with India and converge its security interests with India means that the New Delhi-Tehran partnership is also a far cry away from a strategic partnership, and India is the dominant rising power in this relationship. So the conclusion of the book basically argues that Iran's unlimited ideational aspirations, and I talk about what this unlimited ideational aspiration is and means in detail and how it has influenced elite narratives in Iran, will lead the country to continue to advance its nuclear program. In a sense, I argue that Iran actually, despite its isolation over the fate of its nuclear program, regards itself as a so-called avant-garde revolution. And by avant-garde, I mean that it sees itself as an avant-garde revolution, meaning that it is able to keep the world powers in a constant reactive mode. And that is what gives Iran power to advance its nuclear program, be it with China, with Russia, with India, with the West. But yet, Iran fails to transform it has failed to transform to date its interactions with the major powers, including India, into a vision for longer-term compliance with the non-proliferation regime. It oftentimes falls back on its old narratives that I explained in the beginning of shaming, questioning the West over its non-proliferation narratives, etc., to keep the momentum of its nuclear program going, but then that comes at a cost to its ability to build genuine, deep, long-term, trusting, strategic partnerships with the world powers. Meanwhile, Iran is defiant in that it believes that the world powers are adopting a minimalist approach because of Iran's ability to keep them constantly in a reactive mode. They have fallen on this minimalist approach of pursuing limited options in demanding Iranian compliance with its nuclear non-proliferation commitments under the NPT, or not, but basically asking Iran to comply with the non-proliferation. Whereas Tehran considers this a very limited approach. I mean, how many times can you ask a country to be compliant, and how many times can a country say, sure, but then do what it needs to do, or do what it wants to do? Whereas Iran thinks that it has the upper hand in the negotiations because it enjoys a maximalist approach in the negotiations by constantly being able to come up with alternative plans for its nuclear program that the JCPOA partners cannot always control, as we know. by strengthening its Asia pivot. And this is why the dialogue with India is a source of sustenance for Iran's nuclear program. By using India as a buffer, and I forgot to mention that essentially Iran needs India to serve this buffer role. And it engages in relations with India to the extent that India is able to perform this buffer role for Iran with the West, so that Iran, or with China or Russia, so that Iran can advance its economic, investment, nuclear, diplomatic relations. And this is sad in my view, although it might be strategic in that it prevents the deepening of India-Iran relations. And also for Iran to expand its regional influence in the event of the breakdown of the nuclear talks. So thank you very much for bearing with me. I hope this was a beginning overview of the book, and I am very eager to receive your feedback and any questions or comments that you might have. And thank you again, Dr. Gore, for having me, and thank you all for your patience for waiting for me today.
Thank you very much. Very, very clear exposition of your views on the subject. You have made things very clear and about the contents of the book. And that is the real story of Iran, relationship with great powers. Now I will ask the students, after listening to such a wonderful lecture, that if they have any queries, they should come out and first let them introduce themselves and then ask their question in simple and clear manner. Come on, be quick.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm Riya Sharma and currently I'm pursuing my master's in political science. Ma'am, if we look at the Iran-China axis, ma'am, as you said, they appear as natural partners, both sanctioned by the West. And together with Russia, they form a kind of anti-West alliance. But ma'am, do they really form a solid bloc against the West, given that China's interest in the region, China's engagement in the region has been limited to its economic interests? I mean, on one hand, it has neither been too outgoing with Iran, and on the other hand, it has established equally diplomatic relationship with other Central Asian republics. Ma'am, is there any strong future to the Russia-Iran-China axis?
That's a very good question and a very deep question. And I would say a hard one to answer because, as we know, the China-Iran relationship is evolving. But what I look at is the importance of China serving as an auxiliary power for Iran in reducing Western pressures on Iran. So to the extent that Russia can reduce those pressures, and we know that it has done that repeatedly in the course of the nuclear negotiations with Iran, then the partnership with China is essential for Iran. And it's also essential for China because, as you say, both countries being sanctioned, it's important to minimize Western pressures. And if this partnership can afford that, then they will pursue it. Secondly, because of Iran's isolation and sanctions, China has increasingly spread its economic interests across Iran. And although the dynamics of these strategic partnerships are not always realized in full, when you look on the ground, a great deal has also happened. First of all, they have an agreement, the details of which they have not really fully disclosed. But it involves, among other things, the exploration of Iran's natural gas and oil, which has been sanctioned for a considerable amount of time. It also involves a lot of infrastructure projects. But back to your question, which I think was more geopolitical, I think that within Asia, Iran will constantly use the auxiliary partnership with China because it cannot fall completely under Russian influence. It also needs China to regulate its ties with New Delhi. On the global geopolitical framework, Iran needs to integrate into Asian markets. And so with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS Plus, etc., China is important. But again, to what extent is China important to Iran? That's a very good question. I think the main importance of Iran, besides its energy factor, is stability in the Gulf region. And general stability between Iran and its Arab partners in the Gulf region, or its Arab neighbors in the region. Because if that stability were to be disrupted, then it would have a very negative impact on India and China from an economic standpoint, and on Russia and China from a political standpoint, because it would bring the West back into the region. China, as well as Russia, does not want a prominent Western role in the Gulf waterway, in the Indian Ocean to an extent. I'm not an expert on the Indian Ocean dynamics fully, but I hope this partly answers your question, although I'm aware that it doesn't completely.
Ma'am, I have one more question. Ma'am, recently Albania has become the battleground for Iran and the West. Up till now, ma'am, it is not quite evident that Iran intended to trigger the conflict in the region. But given the repeated cyber attacks by Iran, ma'am, do you think that Iran will get deeper into this conflict? And if it does, is it in Iran's interest to put up another front against the West in yet another region, that is the Balkans?
So when you say conflict, which specific conflict were you referring to? May I ask?
Ma'am, the cyber attacks, particularly with respect to the MEK, the anti-Iranian terrorist group.
Yes. No, it is not wise for Iran to set up a front in the West, and Iran is not planning on doing so very openly either. It doesn't need to open many fronts of confrontation around itself, and certainly not in the West. I think that the cases like cyber attacks, etc., are more a signal of a dissatisfied state of relations between Iran and the West, and an attempt to correct that dissatisfaction where possible by pointing out Europe's vulnerabilities, Western vulnerabilities to potential Iranian influences. As we know, Iran is going through protests, and Tehran is saying that a lot of this protest has been influenced by the West. Now, whether or not that is true, I don't know. But you know, if these are narratives that are being advanced, then we can expect a level of tension between the West, including over Albania, over the MKO, MEK, as you say. But I don't think it will turn into a full-fledged conflict with the West anytime soon, because that does not help the West nor Iran. But I want to say something about the finding in my book. When Iran, in the EU, in the chapter on EU3 and Iran, whenever Iran feels that its security needs are not met through its ties with Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, it tries to remind these three Western powers that they are one of a collective body known as the Europe. There are three, only three, although major three, of a collective body known as the European Union. And Iran believes that as a collective body, the other countries of the European Union are more keen than these three countries that have very important transatlantic relations with the United States to maintain, to have peaceful ties with Iran. And so every now and then, when there is a security breakdown between the three European powers and Iran, in how they engage with Iran, Iran kind of likes to remind them that having peaceful ties with Iran is not essential for peace inside Europe as well. Let's put it that way.
Ma'am, just one little question regarding the protests. Ma'am, it is said that the number of protesters are very small and they lack a shared ideology. Ma'am, do you see these protests bringing any real change in the near future, or they're likely to fizzle out?
I don't think that these protests need a shared ideology, because all you need to be is an Iranian to share some of the sentiments of what is happening inside Iran at the moment. Even within Iran's government, sentiments are being expressed as Iranians, that these protesters must have certain demands that are not being met. I think these protests for the first time mark a kind of collective engagement in society that will not subside. Now, it is true that they are subsiding. It is true that they are more limited than the images that we might see, but they are also persistent to an extent, and it is very difficult to marginalize women, which are a main mover and shaker of what is happening now. Iran protests is nothing new to Iran. Iran is a country that on average has seen 17 protests a day for the past couple of years. Labor protests, teacher protests, bus driver union protests, etc., etc., etc. But women have come to the forefront, and it adds a whole different dynamic. And as we know, others have joined voices with the women. And so it's become a more unified form of protesting that we have not seen happen in Iran before.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Any other question? Come on, be quick.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah, go
on. My question to you is that, do you think that New Delhi is in a difficult position and the Indian-Iran relation is being challenged with the US targeting the Mumbai petrochemical firm, which has purchased oil and methanol and base oil from Iran?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously the issue of US sanctions and international sanctions on Iran is a challenge for any country, any business that seeks to have a foothold in Iran's lucrative markets, because Iran's markets are lucrative, because Iran has been isolated more or less for 40, 45 years. So the market potential of Iran is naturally huge. But I would say that it's not as big a challenge as, excuse me, as one thinks, because India and its relative strategic autonomy has given New Delhi power to negotiate with Washington constantly over India's interests in Iran. And this is a clear finding in my chapter on Iran and India. Even at the peak of tensions between Tehran and Washington during the Trump administration, India was able to negotiate for its interests. And it's not a one-way street in that India negotiates for its interests. Washington also needs India because India also serves a buffer role between Washington and Tehran. For Washington, not just for Tehran, but for Washington. And with Afghanistan opening as a new geopolitical landscape for the United States, Washington, and India and Iran, we can expect some give and take of understandings to happen. And I think India is a vital partner for Washington in this process. So I hope this answers your question to an extent, not to mention that India is now also a part of a larger partnership with the United States geopolitically, which involves partnerships in Asia, partnerships in the Indian Ocean, stronger partnerships with the United Arab Emirates, with Israel, countries that also work closely with Washington. So I think India is in a good position.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, my second question to you is that it has become increasingly apparent that Iran is helping Russia with the kamikaze drones in the Ukraine war, Shahed 131 and the long-range Shahed 136. Now, there is a concern in Israel that Iran will make Russia stop Israel from taking actions in Syria. What is your take on that?
So the concern in Israel, if I understand correctly from what you were saying, is that Iran will prevent Russia's activities in Syria?
Yes, right, ma'am.
Right. Well, I mean, Russia and Israel have been in negotiations over Syria for quite a while, although some of it may not have been publicized. At least that is what it seems to Iran. That gives both Russia and Israel leverage over Iran's activities in Syria. To the extent that the Ukrainian challenge to Russia has diminished Russian capabilities in Syria and thereby enabled Iran to have a wider presence in Syria, well, I think some of that might be a natural argument to make and a natural conclusion to arrive at. But I don't think that it necessarily translates into Russia and Israel Russia not being able to fully dictate its interests in Syria over Iran. Even before the Ukrainian basically challenge that emerged since February to both Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran were not always necessarily getting along in Syria. And Russia could not always control what Iran did in Syria. But because of Russia's bigger partnerships in the region with Israel that Iran does not enjoy with the other Arab countries of the region, I would suspect that Russia will continually be able to control some of what is going on with Iran in Syria. Not to mention, as you know, that Turkey and Russia and and Iran are also still involved in the Astana peace process talks. They just recently met. Turkey plays a very important role in Syria as well. So Iran will not be the only actor. And above all, as both Turkey and Iran try to converge and make that Asia pivot, Iran depends on Russia for survival, for economic survival. Food dependency cannot be taken in any light except very seriously. Iran's ability to integrate its markets into Eurasia are vital for its survival, and Russia plays a dominant role in those markets. Russia can control Iran's ability to export its energy to a very large extent. So I don't think that Iran seeks to upset Russian calculations in Syria collectively, nor does it want to, because Iran is after certain things that Russia is not after in Syria. And as long as Iran can have what it wants, ideationally, and Russia is not a major hindrance to it, and the two can figure out a give and take mode, then I think that while certain factors emerge, like as you say, a reduced Russian presence in Syria, it's too early to say where that will go. But in conclusion, if I may just say, what I found in my book was that Iran by no means has a foreign policy that will stand still and let any world power dictate to it the final course of Iran's foreign policy goals. So your question is an evolving landscape, I would say.
Thank you, ma'am.
So I have a few queries to be clarified by you, and I hope you will be able to do it. My first query is about China's role and its impact on India-Iran relations. Do you think China impacts Iran's relations with India?
I don't think that geopolitically Iran is in a position to impact China's relations with India. But I think that Iran uses China and India to engage them and encourage them to invest more inside Iran. So to the extent that Iran can use New Delhi and Beijing for that purpose, it hasn't hesitated to do so. But as you know, Professor Gore, better than I do, the geopolitics of the region is changing. In Afghanistan as one very prime example. And then so I really don't know how that will affect in Iran's position vis-a-vis India and China. I really don't know. There's also the issue of Pakistan and Pakistan's relations with China that Iran is mindful about. In its interactions with India. And again, in trying to get India to take its partnerships with Iran more seriously. That is all that I know with respect to the findings of my book. However, I think that if India's security interests increasingly converge with Washington and as well to an extent with Israel, and it is projected either in Asia or parts of it or in the Indian Ocean, then I suspect that China and Iran will be watching that very carefully. That's all I think I can say.
So far as China is concerned, China already has a facility of seaport in Pakistan. Now China is again helping Iran and trying to have access to seaport in Iran. So how do you look at it? I mean, two seaports in two different countries, how it is going to help China?
Iran's approach is very piecemeal to this issue in that it will get whatever deal it can because Iran is isolated and sanctioned. So it can't really pick and choose its deals very much. It must take the money that comes in the form of investments. But it's also geopolitically vital for Iran not to be, not to allow either Pakistan or India to override Iran's maritime interests and to be the dominant power in shaping those maritime connections with the Indian Ocean, with farther beyond, etc. So I think that while Iran would like to see a level of engagement with both of its neighbors in the subcontinent, it's what it can take with Russia, what it can build with Russia will be more vital and more important strategically speaking for Iran. And Iran will explore those dynamics to make sure that it has a say in what happens in port development projects in the South, because both Pakistan and India also happen to have very good relations with the United States. And that doesn't help Iran. So I hope this kind of adds a little bit of a texture to the framework that you have laid out.
I would like to repeat a question that has been put in the journal. That is the first question about India is abandoning Iran. I mean, I too, you too. So do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think that India has abandoned Iran. So I don't agree with that assessment. I think that India has its own interests, both economic and otherwise, and also security. Secondly, India-Israeli ties are not new. They have been around for a while. But since the Abraham Accords, obviously this new initiative between India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States would, I imagine, be of concern to Iran. And to the extent that India does not make it a problem for Iran, I don't think that India would have any choice but to live with it, and nor does Iran want to make a deal of it out of it. But if it does become a challenge for Iran's security interests, then I think that both Israel and India can expect Iranian reaction in some form or manner.
One related question to this is, US almost pressurized India not to buy oil from Iran. And India could resist this, pressure and all that. Now, US wants that India should not get Russian oil. But this time, India said, no, we have our own interest and all that, and we have a strategic autonomy. So what happened in the case of Iran? I mean, why couldn't India resist the pressure from US? And there was a time, if I remember correctly, that Iran was the only country and India was the only recipient country where, oil was given on 1 year credit. Full 1 year credit. Iran never asked for payments for more than 1 year. This has never happened in the oil industry. No country has given oil free. I mean, no, not free, but on credit for such a long period. Otherwise, there are advance payments and all that. And so, why? Is the situation different now?
Well, to an extent, I think firstly, it's very vital for Washington to retain a stronger partnership with India and strengthen that partnership. Because I don't think that Washington necessarily has an Indian Ocean policy that is as powerful as the dynamics that are evolving within Asia itself. And India becomes a very important partner for Washington in that respect. And to the extent that Washington can discourage India from opening up its interests with Iran, then it will do so, because in the meantime, Washington needs to isolate Iran furthermore, given the uncertainty of the outcome of the Iran nuclear deal. Given the fact that it is very difficult to imagine a better future for US-Iran relations at the moment, given Iran's challenge to its Arab neighbors and to Israel. Now, with respect to Russia, which you raised, the issue is quite different. I see it quite differently because, to an extent, if I may say, because the West is still dependent on the Russian economy more than it is on Iran's economy. It is easier to isolate Iran's economy in the West than it is easier to isolate Russia in the West. And Russia is still a major power. Russia is a nuclear power, and there have been historic bonds between Russia and India that I imagine Washington is aware of from a geopolitical perspective, recognizing that that is not something that it can disrupt as easily or as immediately. Whereas in Iran's case, because it's increasingly isolated, well, then taking action to isolate it further is easier to an extent. So that does explain perhaps what is happening. Now, in terms of what Washington wants from India, I do not really know in detail. I think these are debates that would have to come out inside India. But what I found in this book is that internal domestic Indian politics also happen to play a role in its relations with Washington, as well as its relations with India. And with Iran, with Iran. And I wonder to what extent Washington is aware of that and how that factors into US-India relations. I'm sorry, but that's the extent of the knowledge I have about this conversation.
Thank you very much for clarifying so many issues associated with this topic of your book. I hope it will be read with interest throughout the world. And I wish you all the success and congratulate you for bringing out, from what I have read about its introduction and that you have explained today, that it will be welcomed by the academic community and it will be read with interest throughout the world. So thank you once again for sparing time and accepting our invite at very short notice. I know you are busy and with your own academic pursuits and all that. So with that, I would like to thank you once again on behalf of FPRC and Foreign Policy School. And we hope to have you in future also when occasion arises, and you will not disappoint us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.
And I look forward to working with you in the future, anytime.
Okay. With your consent, I would like to close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.